Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, From Data to Regulation, Achieve 360-Degree Employee Compliance, sponsored by Bamboo HR and Papayaglobal. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, please click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. A new tab will open in your browser with the webcast survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast has ended. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Papayaglobal and Bamboo HR for their presentation.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you here as we embark on a journey of data to regulation, achieving 360-degree employee compliance, where we'll dive into the essential aspects of the employee compliance management model. Throughout the session, we'll explore real-world challenges, real local regulations, best practices, and the role of automation in simplifying compliance journey. Be prepared to emerge in a comprehensive understanding of how to protect your organization and employees while staying compliant in an ever-evolving regulatory environment. In the ever-changing world of business and finance, ensuring compliance with payroll regulations is not only crucial, but also a legal imperative. From the moment of hiring to the intricacies of termination, every step along the employee journey is fraught with compliance risks that have far-reaching consequences. However, with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of their obligations, organizations can not only navigate the intricate landscape, but also proactively ensure this 360-degree compliance. The webinar is designed to equip you with the knowledge and tools necessary to navigate the complex terrain of payroll compliance. Whether you're a seasoned HR professional, a small business owner, or someone new to the field. What I would like to do before we start, and I think it's really important, is to state that the content here is not legal advice. It is simply for your information. Please consult your legal team should you have any questions or concerns in relation to anything that we discussed today. Our key takeaways by the end of the webinar will be an understanding of employee compliance risks, how to hire globally with confidence, how to simplify data management and automation. So let's take ourselves a moment to familiarize ourselves with the webinar platform once again. As we've been told already, there is a webinar chat function on the Q&A section. Please use that throughout the presentation. We encourage active participation. Your questions and insights are valuable to us and your fellow attendees. So first things first, though, let's get to know everybody. My name is Ian Giles, and I've worked in payroll for the last 25 years. I've had roles in all kinds of industries, retail and beauty to aerospace, in all types of businesses, startup to matrixed environments across the globe. I provided leadership and strategy to populations of more than 100,000 employees on a monthly basis and in over 170 countries. Today, I'm the payroll strategist for Papayaglobal. I work across the business, managing and building external relationships, supporting enterprise clients and solutions, and acting as an advisor. I'd like to introduce our first guest, Greg, who will kick things off by telling us who he is and a little bit more about Bamboo HR. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, as Ian said, my name is Greg Piper. I am the Senior Corporate Counsel at Bamboo HR. So I lead our in-house legal team and actually work very closely with our HR department as well to handle various legal and HR matters that come up. So really excited to be here. About Bamboo HR, if you're not familiar with us, at Bamboo HR, we say our mission is to set you as HR professionals free to do great work. So how do we do that? Well, we do that with our all-in-one software platform. Our software platform can serve as your HRIS, or as kind of your core employee record to manage that employee lifecycle throughout their journey with you as an employee. In addition to a payroll module we have to help you pay those employees and compensate them, and benefits administration module that allows you to help manage the benefits you provide to your employees. So really excited to be here, represent Bamboo HR and talk about this topic. And I guess from my perspective, I'll probably provide a lot of a focus on the US side of things when we talk about kind of global compliance. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Gina, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about Papayaglobal?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone. I'm Gina Dorcelis. I'm the Global Employment Expert Manager at Papayaglobal. I manage the Employment Council in the US, APAC, EMEA, and Israel region. I also serve as US Counsel for Papayaglobal. I'm licensed in New York and New Jersey. We ensure compliance onboarding and offboarding of global workers. With regard to Papayaglobal, we provide payroll, payments, and workforce management as a global service workforce provider to global workers serving in over 160 countries.
Okay, thank you both. I feel completely underqualified sitting here with you both. What I forgot to mention as we were kind of like going through the introduction, so it's really, really nice to actually see in the webinar chat where everybody's actually attending from today. I can see that we have people in Las Vegas and Indiana already. So if you want to carry on telling who you are, that would be absolutely fantastic whilst we just wait for everybody else to kind of like join in. There we go, Chicago as well. So whilst we're doing that and waiting for everybody to kind of join, I'll just run us through the agenda. Today, we are going to discuss hiring global talent, new hire information management, termination, compliance, and automation. Wow, the chat has got really, really busy. So we got Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Toronto, San Francisco, Richmond. You're coming from absolutely everywhere, which is fantastic. So I'm hoping that we're actually going to have some really great commentary and questions throughout the webinar as well. Okay, so that's the agenda done. What I'd like to now cover is the compliance and the privacy side of things. So the journey of an employee and their data is multifaceted without fail, and an ever-evolving relationship that begins the moment a person joins an organization. It continues throughout their employment and beyond. This journey can be divided into several key phases whilst we're actually, that they're employed with us. So onboarding, day-to-day operations, compensation and benefits, professional development. Then we get to the offboarding and even advocacy. So it even happens after the employee has left your employment. Throughout the journey, organizations are responsible for collecting, storing, protecting employee data in compliance with data privacy regulations, no matter where it is you're operating around the world. It often involves implementing secure data management systems and ensuring strict adherence to local requirements to protect both the employee and the organization. The evolution of employee data and management continues to be adapted to the changing landscape of data privacy and the technological advances that we're making at this moment in time, shaping the future of how organizations handle and safeguard this information is absolutely vital. What I want to do before we really get into any more detail is take a first poll just to kind of like get us a flavor and idea of what everybody is looking at and operating with at this moment in time. So without further ado, what I'd like you to do is please answer the following question. How confident do you feel that your company is when it comes to compliance and your global hiring solution? So we have 4 answers for you. The first being not at all confident, the second being somewhat confident, then mostly confident, or we've got it in the bag. Greg, what do you think the outcome to the poll will be? Will there be a different level of confidence across the globe, do you think?
I think we've got a good group here. I'm thinking they're all, at least somewhat confident, right? They're smart people. Hopefully we can add to some of that knowledge today, but I think we'll have a pretty confident group here.
Okay, fantastic. Right, okay, just another couple of seconds and we'll close the poll. We've got some good responses at this moment in time in terms of percentages. We're almost halfway there. So yeah, that would be very, very good to kind of like see that. So I can tell you that 19% of you are not confident at all. 45% of you are somewhat confident. 30% are mostly confident, and 6% of you believe you've got it in the bag. What do we think to the outcome, Greg, Gina?
I agree. I think the somewhat confidence was anticipated. I think that especially I'll be focusing on the more global scale in global compliance. I think there's so many regulations to have a comprehensive understanding to mitigate risk. So I anticipated that everyone would be somewhat confident. Like Greg said, we're smart people, but it can be challenging.
Okay, fantastic. moving on from that, I think that was an absolutely great result. And as Gina's kind of like said, we pretty much expected that kind of response. So in terms of classifying with confidence, employee misclassification has caught out some of the world's biggest companies, and we don't want you to be in a situation where you're joining them. That goes without saying. For me, this is one of the things that keeps giving, and not in a good way. It can catch you out at any time. And I think, we all have to be very, very conscious of what it is we're doing in everyday businesses. It can catch you down the road when an audit is being carried out. And if it goes on for long enough, it even has the potential to impact workers when they retire due to lower pension pots. So it's not just about the today. We need to think about it in 20, 30, maybe even 40 years' time, because there could be some kind of comeback, for people much later in lives. Gina, what can businesses do to protect themselves and their workers?
Absolutely. As Ian stated, this has been a new hot topic given all the penalties that certain companies have received in the media lately. Classification of workers, employees as independent contractors, it's a huge legal risk with substantial potential penalties. And it's vital that companies are cautious when classifying workers as independent contractors simply for the purpose of avoiding paying taxes or lowering business costs. When these contracts or these agreements are under legal scrutiny, courts are not going to look to the independent contract agreement alone. So therefore, companies need to pay particularly careful when they're hiring workers or employees as independent contractors. What companies should carefully consider is the type of relationship with the worker. That's what it's going to hinge on, not what the agreement indicates on its own. This hinges on the control that the company has over the workers and the workers' daily activities. When there is a misclassification, as I indicated, then there's significant legal penalties to companies. What should be the decisive factor is the relationship with the worker. In terms of just a general tool of classifying whether you have an independent contractor or an employee, as you can imagine, independent contractors function independent. They set their own hours, whereas employees, the companies set hours for them. Independent contractors, they determine how tasks are performed, whereas the employee, as you can imagine, an employee, their tasks are controlled by the company. Independent contractors are engaged for limited purposes. Their provision or use with the company is limited in scope, whereas employees, they perform multiple tasks, multiple routines. Independent contractors use their own equipment. They're responsible for their own benefits, whereas employees themselves, everything is funded by the company. They're on the employee's payroll. What you really need to be cautious of, this is not an exhaustive list. There are some independent contractors that may have mirrors of employees and vice versa. What you really need to consider is the extent of control that a company has over a worker and the daily tasks. That's what it hinges on. And that will guide you into this process, not the independent contractor agreement alone.
Okay, Greg, anything you'd like to add to what Gina just said?
No, again, this is just a big issue, right? You've seen this with like the Uber cases and others here in the US, Lyft, and just, it's something to be aware of, have a plan, make sure you're classifying your people correctly so that you don't find yourself in hot water with your local, labor division about this issue.
Absolutely. Fantastic. So how can businesses keep themselves up to date with local regulations and nuances? Gina, I'd like to come back to you again.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's vital. This is especially on the global front because I'm going to really focus on global onboarding. Companies really need to be aware of the pitfalls of local legislation and the nuances in the law. It's important that you have the most updated databases so that you're getting alerts as to when there are new regulations as they are constantly changing. Partnering with the best international law firms and external counsel. And also, it's not just enough to know the law. You have to have licensed local expert on the ground in each particular country. Some of the nuances that companies really need to pay attention to: IP assignments. That's an intellectual property assignments is a hot topic issue, especially in the context of the EOR model, where the end client cannot be assigned IP directly with the workers. So it's a vital that there's creative solutions in place. Understanding the pros and cons of entering into fixed versus indefinite contracts. In regions, for example, I've done a few cases in EMEA, in Europe, where it's very difficult to terminate workers, it may be beneficial to enter into fixed term contracts. Understanding the nuances of sick leave. In the US, we have very different laws, and Greg will touch on some of these, but in certain regions in Europe, such as again in the Netherlands, workers can be on sick leave for periods of 2 years and receive the majority of their pay. Particularly, I find with our US clients, it's very, very difficult, and there needs to be a clear understanding of these local legislation. Another aspect to consider is performance improvement plans. It's very vital to put workers on clear performance improvement plans, and not to simply treat all your workers the same, in the sense of global workers need to have very specific PIP plans with measurable goals. Sometimes for lengthy periods of 4 to 6 weeks at a minimum to months. Those are the particular nuances that need to be understood, especially when hiring workers on a more global scale, because I've had cases in France when we're looking at penalties of close to 200,000 euros for workers that's been employed with a company for a year. So it's very, very vital to understand these local legislation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gina. Greg, is there anything you'd like to add from a US point of view? We do have a question in the Q&A section. I'm not quite sure whether or not it's something maybe to leave for the end, but it's actually something that's quite applicable to what it is we're talking about now. I'll ask the question and we'll decide whether or not to actually take it at the end. But if you can kind of give your thoughts from a US point of view, that would be absolutely fantastic. So the question is, what would you recommend for an organization where the executive director refuses to change how independent contractors are classified? The independent contractor is treated like an employee, but HR's recommendation for the changes are disregarded.
That's a great question.
You've got some big smiles there.
It is. Well, I won't say I haven't been a part of conversations like that where we go like, why can't we just classify this person as an independent contractor? Wouldn't that be simpler, right? I think it starts with building good, relationships across the organization, helping them see that you're on their side, right? But I think ultimately in the end, I think you have to help people understand the risks that come with this, right? Help them understand what they could be looking at, right? I mean, whole business models have been questioned around this because they built their whole business model around an independent classification versus an employee classification. And if that ever gets challenged, your whole business model can be up in flames, right? So I get that. I get the temptation. We all want to help. I think there are kind of more creative models you can look at if you're not looking to be an employee. I think Gina's touched on them a little bit. There are kind of EOR models. There are AOR models, right? Employee of record or an agency of record models where there's another party or another organization that kind of takes them on as an employee and then assigns them to you as a worker. Maybe you look at a model like that. But yeah, I think you partner with the business, help them understand the risks that they're taking, and again, try to help them see, look, I'm here to help you find the talent you need. I just want to make sure that when you find that talent, that you're not then being stung by other issues later on, that kind of actually slow down that talent from being able to serve and help your organization. So that's my initial thought. Gina, I don't know if you'd add anything there.
Yeah, that's life of in-house counsel, right? Sometimes we're viewed as blockers, but we're really trying to protect the company. I would say from my perspective, when I come across those issues, the examples, like Gregory said, the Uber case, illustrating examples of what happens in these situations to help sway, and we're all a part of the same team, letting them know exactly, documented in memos, the pros versus versus the cons. But that's essentially our lives in terms of, persuading the company in terms of that. But I said in working with the examples that normally, and another aspect that I wanted to mention is just the reputation to the company as well. Because oftentimes we want quick solutions we want to fix, but one aspect we don't consider is the reputation to the company when there's misclassifications. And that really helps C-suite management when you frame it in that context.
Nobody
It's a really
wants
good point, Gina.
a tweet about your organization and how they are misclassifying people. Nobody likes that. So yes, I get that, Gina, a lot.
This is it. I mean, not necessarily from a legal point of view, but I talk about payroll all of the time, and we talk about compliance, and we talk about getting things right. In terms of benefit realization, it's not all just about the money. You don't want to be in the news for having done the wrong thing, or actually not having sought the right kind of legal advice. The fact that you actually are based and headquartered in one country does not mean that the laws are applicable from that country into another country. So making sure you're actually having the right conversations, you're speaking to the right people is absolutely imperative. I get that you're not here to block anybody's future plans. It's all about creating the most positive experience that we can for absolutely everybody and growing a business. Okay, then moving on to example laws. I just want to kind of like take us through here. And Greg, I think this is your little kind of like section within here. Yeah. So I'd like you to kind of to take it away and give us some examples of what these laws look like and what people need to follow from a US point of view in particular.
Yeah. So again, in addition to a lot of these things that Gina's been talking about, right? There's a lot of employment laws and regulations that are critical to your obligations as an employer, things that you need to be thinking about and having a plan for. How do I comply and manage these laws and regulations to protect your company and do right by your employees at the same time, right? So a couple of these, right? You've got the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, right? This deals with employee health insurance or the provision of employee health insurance and then reporting on that. You've got reporting obligations as an employer. You've got the American with Disabilities Act or the ADA, right? This deals with how do you provide leave and accommodation to your employees with disabilities, right? They have a right under the ADA to enjoy the benefits and all the various things you enjoy as an employee. And so how do you ensure that they can enjoy the benefits of work despite the disabilities they may have? You've got the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? It deals with employee classification, kind of gets to what we're talking about beforehand, but also from a kind of an exempt and non-exempt category. In other words, are the employees you have subject to overtime pay, right? Or are they not? And just kind of how do you handle and make sure you're paying them for all the time that they actually work and comply with those wage and hour law requirements. The Family Medical Leave Act is there to help assist employees, right, who need leave for maybe personal or family medical issues, right? And they have you as an employer have an obligation to provide that leave and also maintain their job role for when they come back, right? So how are you going to handle those requests and manage those leave time out both for the employee, but then operationally at your company, right? And continue work or ensure that work continues, while that employee is on leave. OSHA is really big, right, for your workplace and safety requirements. How do you ensure, right, that you have a good, safe workplace for your employees to come to, right? This became a big deal over the pandemic, but again, it's much broader than just requirements around that. So, making sure that you have a good, safe work environment and so on is key to just, helping your employees have a good experience while they work for you. And then finally, I kind of point out, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail later on, but, you've got to be mindful of just kind of wrongful discharge or termination issues, right? Are you discriminating or retaliating when you terminate somebody? Really, like any one of these issues could probably be a webinar in and of itself, but the point is simply here to be familiar with the legal and regulatory obligations that you have and have a plan in place to comply with them so you're not caught flat-footed, right? And I'd love to be able to say, yep, read those laws once and kind of you're done. But unfortunately, laws do change. They do evolve. There's a constant new guidance coming out from regulators every year. So, one of the things we might recommend here you do is that you really ought to be probably trying to complete an organization-wide compliance audit every year. This HR compliance audit, Ian, if you'll move the slides forward a little bit, it's going to kind of consist of two main things. One, it's going to be probably an evaluation of your organization's operational HR policies, practices, and processes. So what does that look like kind of more practically? Well, you're probably going to want to, for example, evaluate how do you handle employee leave and accommodation requests under the ADA or the FMLA, for example. You probably want to review the classifications of your employees, independent contractor versus employee, exempt versus non-exempt, right? Review those classifications every year, and then ensure that you've got processes in place to handle wage and overtime requirements you might have for employees. Probably want to review your hiring and firing practices, right? Like how do you onboard somebody, complete the required things that they're a part of that? How do you terminate somebody, ensure there's a good experience there and you handle the things you need to and you're not being discriminatory or something? So how do you do that every year? I would also recommend, again, thinking about the reporting obligations you've got. For example, the ACA has some reporting obligations about employees and their health insurance. So how are you going to handle and meet those every year? And then you probably ought to take a look at maybe, how do you handle investigations of harassment or discrimination, right? That will help keep you out of the bullseye from your local labor division. And so looking at those processes, all these things should hopefully help you identify some just common compliance issues that may come up, right? And we've kind of got a list of them kind of right there that we'll go into more detail. The second piece, though, and this gets a little bit more, I think, to just making a great employee experience is like you probably want to review kind of current HR numbers, right? Like look at what positions do you have that aren't filled? Like, are you experiencing a lot of turnover in one division or not? Like, what does your employee satisfaction look like? There's a lot of ways maybe you could go about doing that, right? There's employee surveys, for example, that you could maybe conduct, and there's numerous tools that'll help you do that. One thing that we like to look at actually at Bamboo HR here is what's called ENPS scores, kind of groups employees into what we call promoters or distractors from the organization. Essentially, would an employee recommend to somebody they know that they come work for your organization? And there's kind of a breakdown of further things that you can do there, but looking at stuff like that can help you identify like what else can we be doing to help our employees have a good experience here and make sure that we're doing the things we're supposed to be doing. So with all of this, I think I would just say to make sure you stay compliant, you're doing the things you need to. It's really important that you keep accurate and organized employee files, not just as a basic kind of business function, but just as an important legal protection. And I often think examples are helpful here. For example, it's going to be hard to prove to a regulator that you paid your employees proper overtime if you didn't track and manage their time, right? Or it's going to be difficult to show that you appropriately handled an accommodation request from an employee under the ADA if you didn't document the interactive process with the employee to review and consider their requests. So a lot of people that I talk to who are experts in employment law will say, like, if something isn't on paper or isn't documented in the employee's file, it didn't happen. So be sure you have good documentation for the stuff that you're doing, so that you can show your compliance with state and local regulations, and you don't end up in a he said she said situation where the employees claiming, I don't know, they worked 40 hours of overtime and then you're saying, no, you didn't, that's not on my records. If you don't have proper records to document what you're doing, you'll have a hard time kind of demonstrating that compliance at times. So
okay, thanks, Greg. I'll let you kind of like take a rest for water or whatever it was that you might. It was quite a lengthy sort of something, and the next section is quite heavily you as well. So, Gina, have you got anything that you might like to add to what Greg's just said?
Other than, especially on the global front, a lot of the legislation equally applies. It's important to have vital records. I think that's the first step, especially if a case ends up in litigation. You don't want to be in a space where you're backtracking and trying to amend and correct records after the fact, and also not being compliant. So I echo those sentiments. Please, employee records, they need to be thorough. It's hard to prove, and if a worker makes a claim of discrimination in writing, there needs to be a follow-up in writing. There's a tendency sometimes with companies and employers to have one-on-one meetings. However, there needs to be a paper trail. Wage and hour compliance, and I've had a case in Brazil where the worker had indicated that they worked overtime hours, yet the company denied it. Yet there are spreadsheets and time logins of the worker after the termination date. So as Greg said, how can you say this particular worker did not work overtime when they're logging into their computer after a termination date? There's not proper follow-up in that case. Suffice it to say that particular company had to pay and settle for those overtime wage hours. So it's very important to take heed and keep vital and proper documentation.
Excellent points. I'm absolutely with you there. If we talk about paper records, long gone are the days where we could make things up. We have a digital footprint now, and it's a lot less easy to actually to fake records and try to say that something happened well and truly after the fact. With the way that we log into systems these days, you can find out at any point in time who's done what, when they did it. So all the evidence is there. It's not something you can get away from. So making sure that you're keeping these records as accurate as you possibly can at the right point in time is absolutely vital. What I'd like to do now is to move on to the eligibility verification side of things. So Greg, over to you yet again.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to talk about that. So, right, as part of authorizing employment, like new hires and employers must fill out something called an I-9, right? Essentially, it's so the new hire can provide documentation that verifies two things. One, their identity, right? They are who they say they are. And two, that they do have employment eligibility or the right to work in the U.S., right? Similar things more broadly across the world as well. But from the U.S. perspective, right, that's what we're trying to confirm, right? There's actually a very tight timeline to do this, right? They need to fill out and submit this form and the required documents within 3 days of hire, right? So it's not something you can dilly-dally about. You got to make sure you've got a process in place. So to verify both of those things, again, their identity and their proof of employment eligibility, there's kind of 3 lists you can go off of: list A, list B, list C. List A is great because what it can do is with one document, you can prove both things, both their identity and their employment authorization. So there we're talking about things like their passport, certificates of U.S. citizenship or naturalization, maybe an unexpired temporary resident card. Any of those things will prove both their identity and their authorization to work. If that's not available, though, then what you need to do is you're going to need to look at both lists B and C, and they'll need to provide something from both of those lists. So list B involves documents that will validate their identity. Again, things you're talking about are a driver's license, maybe a school ID card, voter registration, or U.S. military draft card. Any one of those will validate a person's identity. But then to validate their employment eligibility, you're going to look to list C. And there, again, several options, right? You've got your social security card, maybe a copy of a birth certificate or certificate of birth abroad, or a U.S. citizen ID card, right? So any one of those things together, both a list B and a list C document will validate their identity and their right to work. Now, I do want to make a quick note here. Again, we won't go in much depth here, but something to kind of stick in the back of your brain, right? If you're going to employ a foreign student, there's actually some additional requirements that are needed for them to verify their work authorization in the U.S. Again, a little bit beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover here, but just keep that in mind. There's some additional stuff you're going to need to do because they have kind of certain restrictions and obligations they have while they're here on those particular visas, that they'll have to prove some additional things and have some additional requirements about how much they can work and what they can do. So keep that in mind as well if you're going to bring on like a foreign student or something of that nature. But again, just another point again about how important it is to just keep accurate and organized records because of that tight timeline to identify their identity and their employment eligibility to work with you. So these records, again, there's a retention period to them, right? So I-9 records have to be maintained by the employers for the longer of either 3 years from their hire date or 1 year from termination date. So in other words, keep it for 3 years after you've hired them, or if let's say they only work for a year from you or so, you have to keep it for a year after they're terminated. And it's important, again, to maintain those records and keep them appropriately because you can actually be subject to audits by ICE, right? They're the federal regulator in charge of I-9 compliance. So being able to demonstrate How did you get this I-9? And how did you review their identity and employment verification documents? It really starts with, I think, having a good policy and process in place to obtain those records, manage those records, and then keep them for the right period of time. So if you have questions, again, maybe seek some professional advice, but it's just a key process you need to engage in.
Okay, thanks. And Gina, from a more international point of view, obviously within the US, we're looking at 3 years. Can you give examples, maybe just a couple of what we're looking like, in terms of the rest of the world? You're on mute, Gina.
Yeah, absolutely. And globally, it's very similar in that sense. I would say by and large, on a large scale, having the appropriate documentation, the appropriate records. But one aspect to consider is immigration issues. At Papaya, we have immigration experts on file in determining that workers have certain visas. So we have to work with particular jurisdictions and get permissions from the state, background checks to ensure there isn't criminal activity. It's similar in the sense with the US, but it's a bit more delved in detailed when it comes to visa issues and backgrounds.
Okay, thanks very much. So we're now just about to move on to more of the new hire information. Before we do that, I'd like to take us into our second poll. So the question itself is, how do you currently store employee information? 4 choices again: physical records, spreadsheets mostly, HRIS platform, or was this something that I was supposed to do? So we'll leave it open for another 30 seconds or so. Responses so far are absolutely fantastic and coming in. There's a clear winner at this moment in time. So Greg, Gina, what do we think the results are going to be this time? I think it's very, very dependent on the size of business that you are and potentially even where you're located.
Yeah, I think it depends on the size. And I would say, generally speaking, we're probably going to get anywhere from spreadsheets or some type of platform solution.
Yeah,
okay.
I think it feels similar.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, poll is now closed. We hit that magic 50+% of participation, which is great. I'm really, really pleased to actually say that option 4's result was 0. Nobody is telling us that they weren't aware that they were supposed to be doing anything, which is great. So firstly, we have physical records at 31%, spreadsheets mostly at 4%, and the HRIS platform at 65%. I think that was definitely the way that I saw it kind of going. Not surprised by the results.
Yes, a little surprised a lot of people are doing physical records still.
I'm a little surprised about the
That's
physical
okay.
records,
That's all right.
especially it's perfectly fine, but especially in the post-COVID world where we're hybrid systems, that was a little surprising. But I'm very impressed and very happy about the platform aspect, HRS platform results.
Absolutely. I mean, the only one point that I would probably add to this, and it's probably a very, very unfortunate one, but I would imagine that those people keeping physical records potentially are repeating a task that is actually in the HRS system. Maybe there is an element of not trusting it. We like paper, it feels nice in our hands and all of that kind of stuff. But I think there is a very, very high possibility that a job is being done more than once within a business. Okay, I'd like to come to you again for the next few questions. One of the questions that is frequently asked is, what employee information should I keep? It can vary on several different fronts: where they work, where work is carried out, the country, or where the business is headquartered, for example. Can you share your experiences with the audience in terms of that?
Yeah, there are a lot of types of employee data you probably ought to be maintaining and recording. You can kind of see some of the categories here, and I won't go through each little bullet point, right? But there's documents around your hiring, and applicant tracking, right? How are you hiring and tracking your candidates for your open positions? Documentation around the employee's personal information, right? So you know who it is you've got and who's working for you. You've got probably records around their performance or just kind of their life cycle, whether that's, job title changes, performance evaluations, maybe disciplinary actions, if it comes to that, right? But you've probably got a lot of records around that you ought to be maintaining, as well as then just your onboarding documentation, right? Like a lot of times, right, you've got contracts you want people to accept when they come on or acknowledge your employee handbook. So there's a lot of documents you may try to maintain throughout that kind of employee life cycle there.
Okay, fantastic. So in terms of having all of this data, what are the best practices for storing and compliantly maintaining employee records?
Yeah, right. I mean, we kind of use it in the poll question to see where you're at, but right, we've got kind of the three particular types, right? You've got your physical records, right? And I think again, that can be a great place to start, right? Sometimes it helps me, at least. I like to still read physical books, for example. So I think you can start in that spot, right? Of let me compile all the various records that I might want to have on this employee, put it down on paper. Let's get it saved and recorded and stored, in a good place where we can easily retrieve them. And I think that's a great place to start, right? I do think, there are some potential downsides to that, right? It may not be as secure if it's just in a filing cabinet somewhere in the office. Or again, it can be easy to lose, right? If you've only got kind of one acknowledgement of your employee handbook that's on a paper document, if that paper document gets lost, then you don't have much to go back on, right? So it can leave something open with that, but I do think that it can help you really start to compile what is it that I have and I need to maintain for my employees and get it all in one place. I think a lot of people from there kind of move to spreadsheets, or again, maybe some digital documentation, right? You start tracking them, on your computer. You can kind of keep maybe them a little bit more secure depending on how you set up your computer network and how you manage access to files. But they often maybe have their own limitations as well. I use a lot of spreadsheets and kind of template documents in my work as an attorney, and I often find myself going, wait a second, is this the most updated spreadsheet for this report, or is this like most updated legal contract for this? So there is some still work to maybe keep those reconciled and maintained, especially as an organization grows and you got a lot of people looking at the same kind of digital documents. So again, I think that's why a lot of HR professionals are shifting to a cloud-based employee solution. We're a little biased about that when it comes to us, right? At Bamboo HR, this is what we do, but I do think it gives you a single secure database and a paperless database where you can stay organized. And it's just a matter of oftentimes clicking a few buttons so you can trust your data and get to your data as quickly as possible.
Absolutely valid, fantastic points there. There was a little comment in the chat about the fact that we didn't mention e-records within our last poll. It's maybe a little remiss of us, but obviously, from what Greg has just said, there are businesses, and even more moving into that kind of direction. So, yeah, absolutely fantastic and valid point. What I'd like to do is now take us into our third and final poll. And this should be an interesting one, I think. So, question this time around is, at what stage does your business involve the legal counsel when terminating or offboarding an employee? The answers to choose from are before, during, after, or when we're being sued. Obviously, we're hoping that there shouldn't be too many of the latter. Greg, Gina, what do we think?
I think go ahead, Greg.
Oh, sorry, Gina. I'm going to say that we're about 50% before. I'm going to, as an attorney, I'm going to be optimistic and say 50% before.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say split between before and during. Ideally before.
Okay, so we've actually hit bang on 50%. So we'll close the poll now and we'll kind of discuss it. So, and Greg, would you be really, really horrified if I was to tell you that 23% of the participants told us that they would involve legal counsel when they were being sued?
Well, I guess again, it's better late than never, right? Like better to get some help
There's
than
still a
not get
chance.
any help at all. I will say that. But again, I realize, sometimes small organizations, you may not have the budget for an in-house legal team. You may not have a budget to always, send every HR question you've got to outside legal counsel. But I think, maybe what, a great step you can take there then is, again, maybe take the time to get a little bit of legal help on the front end to make sure you've got some of these good processes in place that we've been talking about, so that hopefully it doesn't ever get to the point where you're getting sued. But again, I hope you have a trusted legal advisor that you can go to for help with these types of things, to help you navigate them. So
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. So the results themselves were before at 62%, during 12%, after was only 3%, and when we're being sued was 23%. Gina, anything to add to that from your point of view?
Yeah, from a global perspective, it's a bit unique in the sense that it's very important as you're onboarding the worker to understand how to offboard the worker, because your employment contract may determine termination. For example, if it's a particularly unique task, you may want to enter into a fixed contract. So I would always recommend either before or during, you need to know what it looks like when you're hiring workers, how to terminate those workers, especially on a global scale where significant severance, I'll touch on in a bit, may be paid to the worker. It's very useful to understand that.
Okay, thanks very much. So moving on now to termination and offboarding after we've actually carried out that poll. As you saw from the poll responses or heard, terminating an employee can vary significantly around the world due to differences in labor laws, cultural norms, business practices. I don't want to steal either Greg or Gina's responses here. So, Greg, how can organizations get a better handle on this? What is a very, very delicate issue? How can they get ahead of the game and prepare for this?
yeah, I think, again, it comes down to designing just an offboarding experience that is both helpful for the employer and the employee, just to smooth out that transition period, right? Nobody loves to see a worker go, but I think if you create a good offboarding experience, and I guess I'm kind of speaking a little more practically right now, we're going to get into some of the more legal aspects, but I think it can smooth out that transition. So, from the employer side of things, I think you're thinking about, how do we manage and handle any potential legal, maybe security even issues as we terminate this individual, right? How do we preserve the essential knowledge, right, from a departing employee? They often develop a lot of kind of tribal knowledge about how things are done and run in your organization. And if you have a good kind of mechanism to pass the torch on things like projects, systems access, et cetera, you're going to kind of help smooth out your operations and keep them moving. This is a great opportunity really to identify any needed improvements, right, that you have based on feedback from the employees in an exit interview or maybe other kind of survey mechanisms. So finding ways to keep those who are still there at your company engaged and happy. I think this is a great opportunity to do that as well. And then just, again, maintain some positive relationships with those former employees, so they're encouraged to return. We've seen that several times at Bamboo HR. We try to have a good offboarding experience. It helps them feel validated and valued for the contributions they did make to the company, so that then, if circumstances change, people leave for all sorts of reasons, personal, familial, they may not be because they didn't want to work at your company per se anymore. And so how do you help them feel valued so that if the opportunity presents itself, they're ready and willing to come back?
Absolutely, not closed doors.
Yeah, I will make one note here, as we kind of transition to some more of the kind of legal aspects. Depending on the size of your organization, and really this kind of applies to employers of 100 or more workers in the U.S., you're going to want to keep in mind you may have obligations under what's called the WARN Act, or the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. There's some similar state laws that do kind of some similar things, but essentially it's, if you're going to do a large layoff or reduction in force of your employee base, there's often some notification obligations you have to provide, some kind of disclosures that go to the individual employee. So something to keep in mind, if this isn't like a one-off basis, but this is a large reduction in force, there's some obligations you have there to notify and take care of your employees on their way out. So keep that in mind.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Gina, anything that you'd like to add to there?
Yes, absolutely. On the global side of things, there's four key aspects that I think it's important for employers to pay attention to when it comes to terminating global workers. Generally in the US, we have at-will employment other than being in a protected class, generally speaking, but overseas, globally, you have to have grounds for termination. That's irrespective of protective classes. So understand the grounds for termination. Understand the notice provisions. Like I said, in the US, generally can be at will. However, usually overseas, particularly in EMEA, there's notice provisions to be honored. Understanding when you're going to pay in lieu of notice for effective termination. If you're dealing with a sick worker, putting workers on garden leave so they can take advantage of healthcare benefits, whether if there's business needs, whether the worker is going to work throughout the notice provisions. Determining the mandatory severance. Typically, severance is required overseas. So fully understanding the mandatory severance aspects. Even knowing the specific mandatory requirements, it's important to understand to follow the customs. So although on paper, in the legislation, in a worker in France may be entitled to 3 months notice or 3 months severance, the custom may be to offer that particular worker to not offend the worker, or to understand the custom to come up with creative solutions to offboard with workers. For example, positive reference letters that can motivate a worker to accept lower severances. So I would say the 4 key aspects would be understanding the grounds for termination, fully understanding the notice provisions, determining the mandatory severance, and following the specific customs of the country with the assistance of local experts. And I saw some comments in the chat, and I do think I personally have worked with a lot of HR teams that are very well versed in this front. As long as you engage legal at one point, like for example, with some of our companies, they may closely work with legal with one type of termination, and moving forward, HR can assist moving forward as there's some template and guidelines. But as long as you understand those 4 aspects when it comes to global offboarding, you're on the right start.
Okay, thanks so much. I've just become very, very aware of the time myself. So what I'd like to do is to actually very, very quickly move us on to a brief overview of the automation side, and then maybe take a couple of questions for Greg and Gina. So automation can play a crucial role in helping businesses stay compliant with regulations and laws around the world. Regulatory compliance is complex and can be time consuming, especially when dealing with international regulations. It can be used to continuously monitor regulatory changes and updates from different regions when used effectively. By setting up automated alerts and notifications, you can stay informed about new laws and regulations that may affect your business. So what I'd like to do is to move on to a couple of questions after a very, very brief conclusion. So I'm hoping that everybody has found this both insightful and a good use of their time. I didn't think for a second we were going to kind of like run this close to the wire in terms of questions and that kind of thing. But as we said a little earlier in the conversation, a lot of what we've talked about are webinars on their own, and maybe for another day. So I'm hoping that everybody has been able to make sure that you're able to classify employees with confidence. Even the big boys do get this wrong. Not everywhere treats everything the same way. So if you are in any kind of doubt, make sure that you get the right support. Make sure that you handle new hires and terminations with caution, and keep data for only as long as you need to. Do not hoard that data. So it will take us to the question and answer section of the webinar. So Greg, one of the questions that we've had in is, how long should we keep employee records for? We've touched on it, but there are lots of different nuances depending on where we're actually operating.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't want to give the lawyer answer of it depends, but it does kind of depend, right? on the what type of records you're talking about, like where are your employees located, the state and local regulations, right? SHRM has a recommendation that, like, you probably use maybe 7 years as a good kind of starting rule for how long you might maintain your kind of employee file. That will generally cover most kind of state or federal regulations. But again, keep in mind, again, right, as we talked about, there's shorter rules for like I-9 forms, and other kind of maybe longer term periods may apply for like OSHA exposure records. So again, it's going to vary. It's going to depend on the record type. It's going to depend on the state. So again, work with some legal counsel as appropriate, or design some good policies and procedures from some good resources to make sure you're complying with what's applicable to you based on where you're located and where your employees are sat.
Okay, thank you. And Gina, can you give us 2 or 3 examples of the biggest challenges surrounding terminating global workers, or maybe even relative to US workers? What are the 2 or 3 things that we're supposed to be watching out for?
Absolutely. I would say when it comes to foreign workers, ensuring that the grounds for termination are appropriate, you have to be clear on the type of language that you're using in the termination conversation when you're speaking to a worker. If the grounds for termination is the economics of the company don't discuss how the worker is poor performing, then you would have to prove that you had an adequate PIP plan in place. So the language needs to be understood and to be clear. It's a challenge for U.S. employers to understand the length of the process. When you have a reduction in force, you may have to go through a redundancy process. You may have to offer roles to the worker. And just to give an example of one of the most difficult and challenging places to terminate workers in Netherlands, and that's particularly because you cannot unilaterally terminate workers. You cannot unilaterally terminate workers without permission from the labor court authorities. That's why it's important to enter into mutual termination agreements. So it's important to have experts or engage in Papayaglobal. This is what we do. We assist our clients in offboarding and onboarding global workers to assist you to mitigate damages.
Okay, thanks. A question for both of you. Very, very quick answers, but can you give me 2 resources each for where people can find the best kinds of pieces of information about what we've been talking about today? Greg, you're both waiting for each other, so we'll pick you first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the probably most straightforward ones is SHRM, right? SHRM's a great resource for most HR professionals, keep you up to date on a lot of what's going on and how to comply with many of these requirements and obligations. Couple that I use that may be a little bit off the beaten path for some people. And again, they are more legal focused, but anybody can access them if they want to purchase a subscription. I use something called Practical Law Company. I mean, this covers all sorts of legal topics, but it's something provided by Thomson and Reuters, and they have a great labor and employment section. Gives you great walkouts of, or kind of rundowns of kind of all these various laws and what your obligations are. They have great templates and things like that you can use for creating policies and other things. And then the other one that I use is something called Practicing Law Institute, PLI. It's essentially they run a bunch of kind of webinars, kind of like this, on topics with experts in the field. So something that I watch a lot when I want to stay up to date on what's happening in employment law, regulations, and so on.
Okay, thanks, and Gina.
One of the resources that I use that I find invaluable, especially when it comes to global offboarding on onboarding, is we engage with an international law firm, BLI Piper. It pretty much uses databases and resources for it by country that really can sum up different regulations per law. Also, in terms of watching webinars such as this, often in-house Connect, I would watch certain programs. However, it's not just employment focused, so paying key attention to the employment aspect. And we engage at Papayaglobal with local experts in each country, having connections with each HR. So those are some of the resources that I use.
Okay, thanks very much. So we have run out of time. I will just say that we do have everybody's email addresses. We will actually look through the Q&A and the chats windows. If we haven't answered any of your questions, we will actually come back to people. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope we've given you a lot to think about, and I'd really like to thank both Greg and Gina for joining me to share their experiences and their knowledge. If you do have a question after we close out, please feel free to reach to us on anything that you've actually seen within here today. Please also feel free to visit both of the websites, as papayaglobal.com and bamboohr.com, for any of your questions or needs that you might have. There's a host of information on both sites, such as content and ebooks, videos, and blogs. Just one more final time, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Greg and Gina.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording will be available on the hr.com website within 24 hours. The webcast credit will show in your hr.com account within 2 business days, and we'll also send you an email with your credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.